Training camp is underway, and Winnipeg Jets fans are worried about a lot of different things, whether it's the supposed line combos or the Cole Perfetti contract extension. Let's talk about whether or not the panic is merited on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said on the off, obviously Jets fans right now are kind of having a bit of a conniption over some line combinations in training camp and the Cole Perfetti contract situation, which continues to be a bit of a concern for Winnipeg. I think, for fans and for the team, all of this just feels a little bit too uncertain for anyone's liking. And I get that. I respect it. I don't think it's entirely wrong. But I sort of have some thoughts on both sides of it, right? I think that there are some legitimately concerning aspects to this whole process and also some things that might just be, maybe a little bit premature to be too worried about. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, circling back to this question of are fans panicking appropriately, right? Is there merit to the concern that the Jets are maybe getting some things wrong before the season starts? And I think there is some merit to it. I don't want to say that I entirely believe all of this stuff is not going to work itself out over time, but I do think that past history with the Winnipeg Jets doesn't always project favorably for their future decision-making. And I think one of the biggest things that you look at is just already taking a look at some of the line combinations. Winnipeg is kind of doing some stuff with their preseason lineups, which, it does seem like the Jets are going to be leaning a lot more on the youth, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in some of the preseason discussions from Scott Arniel. But with the veterans, you see Ehlers, Nemesnikov, and Iafallo on a line, Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton, Connor and Scheifele and Velarde, and so when you see these trios, the first thing that probably sticks out is that this is extremely similar to what the Jets ran in previous seasons. And I think for a lot of Jets fans, myself included, that's just not going to be good enough. Look, I think that there's some merit to having guys playing together who have familiarity and chemistry, but I think we know that the Jets lines in past seasons didn't really translate to a lot of on-ice success. And that's where I think Winnipeg's veteran lines need to be better arranged this year. Now, I've seen a lot of people talking about the Jets not having learned from their mistakes. A lot of folks criticizing the analytics summit, saying the Jets basically learned nothing from this and that it was all lip service. And I don't know that I'm necessarily jumping to that conclusion yet. And the reason that I have this thought is because Arniel was the guy who first put together Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde. Now, it was kind of out of necessity at the time, but I suspect that he saw the same things that we did, and I don't think Arniel is oblivious to that. I think he's a smart guy. I think that he's learned a lot, and I think that as an NHL head coach, he is trying to be more open-minded about things, which is why he wasn't really committal in his earlier statements before camp and stuff were even underway. He was talking about the first line maybe not being locked in place, and so when I see these veteran groupings together, my thought is it might just be that to some degree they're having some guys who have played together, maybe some traditional lineups that Bones might have had in last season just to get guys up to speed. I'm not hitting the panic button yet. I do think I'd probably be more concerned if these lines start to stick in preseason, but based on what Arniel has said in the past, I'm just not really concerned about it quite yet. I will say that fans are probably right to be wary just because this team's history of how they arrange stuff and the rumors that Scheifele does call a lot of the shots probably align with some of what we're seeing with the trios. But by the same token, it is just, training camp. We're seeing some guys hitting the ice for the first time in some time since they had, the offseason to kind of sit and stew after that horrible loss to the Avs. And so there may be some stuff that the Jets are doing to not really shake things up too much off the start. I mean, you're seeing, Stanley and DeMello playing together, and those guys never play together. So I just don't want to sit here and like overly read too much into things yet. I think if we start to see some of these line combos and duos maybe stick together, I might be a little more concerned. But like I said, I don't think I want to jump to too many conclusions based on some of these early training camp groupings. I think the Jets are trying to separate the veterans from the youth, and that may have an impact on what their plans are for the preseason, which we will, again, like I said, chat about that later. Now, the Perfetti thing, I think, is a really interesting conversation because we've talked about it the past few days, but obviously there is some sort of a gap between Perfetti's ask of the same deal that Shane Pinto got, which apparently a lot of teams are not really using that as a framework. Most of them are just ignoring that because the circumstances were a little bit more challenging. I think there was some arbitration stuff. Pinto was coming off of a suspension, and so it didn't really align quite as clearly as the Jets potentially resigning Perfetti. And so with all those circumstances not really being relevant, the Jets think that he's asking for a bit too much. And I've seen some comments on previous videos where people are kind of like, why would you pay him $7-8 million and sign him for several years? And I think it's an interesting question because I don't actually think it's all that straightforward. To me, it might be easy to say that he should be signed long-term, but I think for the Jets, the calculus is twofold, right? The one thing that they're kind of, I guess, considering is if they pay up front, is that money really going to be earned back in savings on the rest of his contract? Because if he becomes like a 60, 70 plus point player, does he really go that far beyond $8 million in the future on his next contract? And I don't know that answer. Maybe he's more in the $8 to $9 million range if everything goes well for him. Maybe it starts to get to the point where he somehow goes beyond that price bracket, which I think becomes an entirely different conversation. But if you're the Jets, you're probably thinking, well, these next 2 years, you might want to save some cash out of pocket just because the Jets' attendance until the past season was hurting a bit. Revenue fell. The team was probably not wanting to just throw money out there. They might be banking on the fact that Perfetti's next contract is going to be not that dissimilar from what, the higher end of this signing now, if it was a long-term deal, might be looking like. And if that's the case, I do understand it. I think my concern is that his next deal is probably going to be considerably more expensive than what he would ask for now because, A, he should have a more proven track record at this point, and B, with the cap going up, that's going to give players more negotiating flexibility and power to ask for more money. That might just start to adjust wage rates to where, there's not actually much of a savings for teams on cap hit percentage when, the players just sort of adjust their contract asks appropriately. So, I see a couple of different things here. I think my thing is that you just want that cost certainty. You want that to be able to plan out for the future. You don't want it to become a problem where you have to negotiate again in a couple of seasons. And if you can buy some of his early UFA years, you probably would be paying for some of his best UFA years rather than also getting some of the perhaps downward decline seasons. So I think it's a little more of a nuanced question than it appears, but I still am very much in favor of getting Perfetti locked up for the future. Now, sort of on a similar note, I just want to talk a little bit about the early line combos. Perfetti obviously isn't in this group right now, and if he comes back soon, he'd probably be taking Iafalo's spot. But we'll talk about what could happen if these line trios stay through preseason and into the regular season. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's a safe, secure, easy-to-use app that gives you tons of props, lines, and odds to make the most informed bet possible. And there's bets covering everything from the NFL to the NHL to MLB, even college sports. They've got auto racing. No matter what you're into, they've got a bet for you somewhere. If you're into golf, tennis, they just love sports, and they want you to have some fun. And sort of on that same vein, we also have something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can get even more sports by betting $5 because they'll get a 3 free-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, and all you need is a Google account and a form of payment. You can cancel anytime, and it's a great way to try out a great service that'll hook you up to all of the awesome NFL action you can handle, including, if you're a Ravens fan and listening to this, 3 free weeks of Ravens football. Although perhaps right now that might not seem like the most appealing thing. If you're ready to get started, though, just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. And remember, you bet $5, you get 3 free weeks. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about some fun stuff ahead of Winnipeg's upcoming training camp and preseason. Training camp is underway, and with preseason also just about to kick off this coming weekend, well, there might be some questions about what to expect, right? And I think some of the early line trios and stuff, the Jets might be tipping their hand a little bit about what they foresee starting the season off with. I just talked about Jets fans maybe panicking a little prematurely, but there's a part of me that also feels some of the same anxiety, right? Connor Scheifele, Velarde being your top line just isn't going to work. CSV, in theory, is a great line. You probably would sit there and think to yourself, how could this go wrong? One of your most gifted goal scorers, one of your most gifted attackers, and Velarde, who's a really versatile Swiss Army knife of offense. How could that trio not work? And it's just a question of, you've got 2 defensive black holes. You've got Velarde, who's not really capable of carrying that line. And so really what they need is somebody who can facilitate zone exits and transition, and that's just not Connor Scheifele or Velarde. Velarde can do it supplementary, but if he is the lead puck carrier, things don't usually go that well. He's a great player. Do not mistake that for a second. Awesome attacker, great winger, and a super creative player that I think Jets fans are going to grow to love. But the thing that this line is missing is somebody who can ferry that puck and carry it into the zone. And, Connor and Scheifele will do it from time to time, but they just don't do it well. And they also spend so much time in their own defensive zone that you find yourself just trapped. In this line, if the Jets roll with it into the regular season, it's probably going to do the same thing it's done every single season. It hasn't really mattered who's played in Velarde's spot. As long as Connor and Scheifele are together, it's just not a good duo. It's a shame that I have to call that out so clearly, but it's been going on for like 6-7 years now, and it really hasn't changed. The second line of Ehlers, Nemesnikov, and Iafallo, which is likely to have Perfetti once he rejoins, I think that's a really good second line, and actually I would probably imagine it doing better than the first line, if I'm being honest. I feel like Connor should be playing with Perfetti. Connor and Perfetti have really good chemistry. We saw it last season. It took them a little bit to get on the same page, but I thought they played off each other really nicely. And Nemesnikov does enough to keep up, right? If you have Connor, Nemesnikov, and Perfetti, I think that that's an amazing second line, and it also sort of balances out some of the goal-scoring capability in your top 6. Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde dominated their minutes. They were super lethal. They were scoring, left and right for a good few weeks. And so my thinking is that if you can swap Connor and Ehlers, it suddenly gives your top 6 a lot more balance in a way that it doesn't have as it's currently constructed. Now, again, these lines are based on some knowledge that preseason's lineups are going to be very different, and the veterans are not likely to play until the end of preseason. So these guys working together now might not really mean anything. But assuming that Arniel is maybe tipping his hand as to who he sees winning spots in the upcoming season, it's not ideal. The fourth line, you've got Janssen Fjallby, Kupari, and Barron, which, I mean, yep, it's definitely a line. Janssen Fjallby I enjoy, but he's probably not a player on most top-end contenders. Kupari skates well and hasn't really been able to put anything together with it. And Barron's just a great player. I think Barron's probably one of my favorite depth guys. And for him to have scored 10-plus goals last season, really impressive in a fourth-line role. The line that I think also gives me some slight heartburn is Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton. And it's not because that's a bad line. In fact, it's very good. But the challenge for the Jets is squeezing more offense out of it when the Jets are already struggling with goal scoring and finishing from the top six. And the third line kind of has to do more to carry that burden. And with Appleton not really being a prolific scorer, Niederreiter also not being that prolific of a scorer, and Lowry mostly just being a really impressive forechecking presence and two-way creator, you find yourself not really having lots of goal scoring to go around. And so I just, I'm not thrilled with those lines. But again, my perception is that these are not likely to stay together, is my guess. I could be wrong, but that's just my impression. Shaw, Gustafsson, and Anderson Dolan were also playing together. I'd kind of hope Gustafsson is not Moose-bound. I think Gus is probably better than a Moose player at this point. And really, if you ever want him to figure it out at the NHL level, he's just going to have to get used to playing routine minutes in the bottom six. I think he's a really fun player. I think there are moments that he shows some real promise, but until he kind of takes that next step going forward, I don't know if he's ever going to move out of that bottom six spot. The other lines, you've got Barlow, Lambert, and Ford, Jagr, Julian, and Shiberkov, Torgerson, Toninato, and Levis, He, Zhilkin, and Lucius, and King, Walton, and Lopone. Now, I can tell you off the bat, these lines, there's a couple of them here that are very clearly Moose lines. Torgerson, Toninato, and Levis, I think all those guys are pretty clearly in the Moose grouping. King, Walton, and Lopone are either in juniors or, in King's case, maybe a free agent ad for the Moose. But you're seeing a pretty young group there. It's interesting that it's very stratified between the veterans on one side and all of the kids and youth on the second side. And that does kind of fit into something that Mike McIntyre said in response to one of my comments about the Jets, hopefully not going back to the same decisions that they've made in the past. He kind of implied that, the Jets are going to dress young teams this coming weekend, which means that lines are probably not likely to stay as they are heading into the actual regular season. These groupings, he suggested, may just be based on who is and who isn't playing. And if that's the case, then, a lot of our heartache and pain is probably premature. But I guess we're all just a little bit nervous after having watched this team for many years. We've seen the cycles that they go through. We kind of know what they're about. And so sometimes when you are staring history repeating itself again, you do kind of start to sweat a little bit. But I think my overall takeaway is just not to panic yet. I want to let the Jets kind of go through their motions in preseason, go through camp, hopefully avoid injuries, get the kids up to speed. And if on opening night the lines are the way they are right now, then we can start to be a little bit frustrated. But I suspect Arniel is trying to do a balanced transition here between his regime and the Bones regime, and this may be an artifact of that at first. It may also be just a sign that Scheifele still has considerable decision-making power in how some of these lines are arranged. And if that's the case, that can be kind of hard to undo. Scheifele, I think, has been given really preferential treatment, and I don't think it's a problem that he has input on what lines he plays on and who he plays with, but the other part of me feels like he has maybe arrived at the wrong conclusion. He's right that, Ehlers is really complicated and tricky to play with, but when you're scoring as much as he does with Ehlers, kind of seems like it's not that great of an argument. But, it is what it is. The Jets are going to be the Jets to some degree, and I've just had to, over the years, learn to accept it. Maybe that's going to be the case again here, but I still want to give Arniel the benefit of the doubt. I don't feel that everything he said in this offseason was just lip service. I'm hopeful that he really does want to move the franchise forward and that he's willing to shake things up. But we'll have to see just how far he's willing to go to get results. Now, like I said, preseason could be very young for the Jets. And I want to talk about what we could see with some of these potential line combos over this coming weekend. But before we dive into that, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of us are used to paying tons of money because you add something to your cart, you go to checkout, and all of a sudden you get hit with like $30 or $40 in surprise charges. And you might ask yourself, am I buying one ticket or two tickets? As it turns out, a lot of us are just buying one ticket. I know when I buy concert tickets, the extra add-in fees are just crazy. Gametime totally understands your pain, and that's why they want to help you save time and money with curated deals to make it easier to find the best price on great seats. They also offer their lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and seat views before you buy. And if you toggle all-in pricing in their settings, you can actually see all of the fees and pricing up front rather than opening up your shopping cart to a nasty little surprise. And if you really want to save time and money, be sure to check out their brand new feature called Gametime Picks that helps to filter out the fluff to show you only the best and most incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. It's one of those scenarios where the closer you get to the start of your event, the lower the price tickets tend to be, and you can save on everything from sports to comedy to concerts to theater. It's totally up to you what you want to do. I've looked at Orioles tickets, and really, there are some great deals out there if you want to save cash ahead of the preseason and postseason. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, go with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just, we're wrapping up with some final thoughts ahead of a busy preseason weekend. Obviously, the start of preseason, training camp sort of wrapping up at this point. And with some of the line combos and stuff, one thing that Mike McIntyre suggested was that the Jets are going to be doing some very young groups, very young lines for preseason too. And I think when you see Barlow, Lambert, and Ford playing together, that to me looks like a Moose lineup, which is very interesting because it's probably like a Moose top line-ish sort of scenario. Lambert, I feel, has very much done enough to earn a spot with the Jets. I think preseason's kind of going to be his coronation ceremony, if you will, a victory lap. I really don't think that there's a reason he just doesn't make Winnipeg's lineup. He's too talented. I think he brings too much potential. And given how good he was at the AHL level last year, there's not really much left for him to prove with the Moose. Winnipeg kind of needs him to be a contributor to the Jets this season, and I think that's most likely the plan. Parker Ford, I think, is an interesting one because last year I thought he was really impressive. In preseason, I thought he had done enough to potentially fight for like a legitimate fourth line spot. Didn't end up panning out that way, but I think this season he could actually have a track at maybe being an injury call-up. I think his game has a lot of utility. I think that he has some really quality puck smarts. He was one of the better players for the Moose last season, and I think, given his relative youthfulness and stuff, he could become a player that the Jets call upon in the future to become a full-time Jet as some of our depth players filter out. In terms of other guys like he, Zilkin, and Lucius, that line feels fairly Moose-bound. He definitely going back to juniors, but Zilkin and Lucius probably Moose first. Lucius is still the guy that I sort of wonder about being maybe a wild card this year. Chaz has had a really troubled development track thanks to all the injuries, and so I don't really know what kind of a player he's going to be yet. There's no guarantee that he even stays healthy and has a foolish pro season this year. Honestly, I could see him getting hurt again, and it wouldn't shock me. I'm really rooting for this guy as hard as I can possibly root for him. I feel like a lot of Jets fans have sort of given up just because of his injury history. And if they had done the same thing to Velarde, you might be in a regrettable situation. But I really feel like this is one guy that I think there's really no reason not to give him another chance to make the Jets or to just be a routine pro player. He's got all the skill. He could become one of our really secret weapons if he stays healthy. I think he has a ton of potential still. It's just how much of it is still there after all of the setbacks he's had. He's a real hardworking kid. I feel like he's got a chip on his shoulder with something to prove. And if he does manage to recover some of his earlier pre-draft form, you do have, again, one of the top tier talents in Winnipeg's prospect pool. But it's just one that might be made of glass. And that's really sad to see that happen. In terms of Jagr, Julian, and Chibrikov playing together, obviously, Jagr and Julian probably going back to junior. Chibrikov, he, I think, is a fringe NHLer at this point. Not because he's not good enough to play for the Jets, but because Winnipeg's probably going to look at some of the other guys like Appleton and Iafallo and prioritize the veterans in depth roles. But I think Chibrikov really does have an inside track to fight for a spot. It actually wouldn't shock me if he does make the Jets regular season opening night lineup, but he's one of those players where I feel like unless a roster spot directly opens for him, he has a little bit of an uphill battle. This is where I think the front office should have done more to maybe figure out what they want to do with Appleton, with Iafallo, with players of that nature, guys that they've signed, and are maybe in the last year or so of their deals. And in Appleton's case, he's got a lot of trade value. Iafallo has some modest value, but probably not loads. Either way, though, I think if you're trying to get 5 to 10% better, you have to start looking at some of your internally developed prospects and giving them a chance to actually earn spots. And maybe they actually will this year. Maybe the Jets are really going to lean on that. Maybe it's going to be more than just Lambert and Heinola to make the lineup. But until we really see that happen, it really sits in the realm of theory. So the Jets, quite frankly, have a lot of questions to sort out. I think these line combinations are very much fluid. I don't think Arniel himself quite has a clear picture yet of what he wants to do. But, I'm going to keep an open mind about all of it. I think that this is a real chance for the Jets to take a different step, to move in a different direction, to go forward for the first time in a long time. And so I don't want to just crap on everything and be dour and upset when, it really is just training camp. We're not quite there yet. And so I want to give the Jets and Arniel perhaps a little bit more the benefit of the doubt, right? I don't want to like jump to too many conclusions here. And so if that's the case, let's just kind of see what happens with the team. Let's not jump the gun, give it some time, and hopefully the Jets come to some real good line combos that help us have a winning season. But let me know how you're feeling about the training camp lineups. Are you concerned? Are you happy with the lineups? Would you make any particular changes? Drop your thoughts in comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for one last episode this week, and then probably, maybe a short game summary or something over the weekend from at least one of the preseason games. But next week, we will definitely have more in-depth preseason thoughts. But like I said, that's all the time that we have for tonight. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.